The 1600s witnessed the dawning of modern science. France, spearheaded by René Descartes, was at the center of scientific progress. Pascal helped contribute to the mathematical progress of the 1600s. In our reading, we see Pascal developing a primitive form of decision theory based on assessing probabilities. Pascal's interest in the mathematics of probabilities originally stemmed from gambling, though he did leave this interest behind as he became more religious in the last 10 years of his life. Our reading is from a collection of journal entries and collected thoughts that were not published until after Pascal's rather early death at the age of 39. Among the topics we will cover, the most important, of course, is the wager that Pascal thinks we should all make. The wager concerns whether we should believe God exists. But first, it's important to understand what Pascal thinks of human knowledge more generally. What are the limits of human knowledge? What kinds of things are we capable of knowing? It's obvious that humans can understand finite things, since we are finite beings. In other words, we can study and understand stuff that we can observe using our 5 senses. Humans do not know nearly as much about the infinite, but we know that the infinite exists. Take, for instance, the use of infinity in mathematics to perform many different kinds of calculations. Hence, Pascal thinks that humans know that the infinite exists, but we do not directly understand its nature. What about humans' knowledge of God? Unlike the infinite in nature, Pascal thinks humans only know of God's existence through religious faith, and we can only understand God's nature in the afterlife. But Pascal thinks that careful reasoning shows that we should believe in God despite our severe intellectual limits. At this point, Pascal sets aside his Christian faith and contemplates whether to believe in God based solely on human reason. In other words, what does our finite intellectual capabilities say about the problem? It might seem like not much, since, as mentioned earlier, God is completely incomprehensible to human reason. But Pascal takes an unusual approach to the problem of whether God exists. Either God exists or God does not exist. Coin flips also only have 2 possible outcomes. Either a coin lands on heads or it lands on tails. Let's imagine there's a coin toss an infinite distance away from you. Furthermore, you are asked to wager money on whether the coin will land heads or tails. Which should you choose? Pascal thinks you would be a fool to wager money on the coin flip, regardless of whether you happen to pick the right outcome or not. The appropriate thing to do is to completely avoid the wager, since you have no idea what is going on with the coin. But the case of God, Pascal thinks, is completely different. We might know just as little about God, but we have to wager on this question. Simply being alive forces the question upon us. You might say that you don't want to care about the existence of God, and so will avoid making a wager. But this would simply amount to wagering that God does not exist, since you would presumably be judged for not having addressed the question, if in fact there exists a God. Before deciding on our wager, Pascal lays out what's at stake. As we work through different versions of the wager, we will return to the issues of error and misery. Pascal's approach to the question of God's existence is very different from that of his contemporaries and previous writers. Compared to his contemporaries, Pascal sounds like he's giving a cost-benefit analysis at a business meeting rather than contemplating sacred mysteries. But Pascal is okay with this approach in part because, as we discussed earlier, he thinks human reason cannot directly prove or disprove God's existence. But careful reasoning, Pascal thinks, shows that we should wager on God's existence. In the table on the right, we see a primitive probability matrix. The leftmost column shows our 2 possible wagers, while the top row corresponds to the 2 possible metaphysical truths. If we wager that God exists, and God does exist, then we could gain an eternal life. Moving to the right, if we wager that God exists, but it turns out that there is no God, Pascal does not think we lose anything. We will still live our life. Now moving to the bottom row, let's see what happens when we wager against God. If we wager against God, but it turns out that God exists, then we will probably suffer dearly, maybe even be condemned to the hell that is described in many religions. If we wager against God, and God doesn't exist, then Pascal thinks we'll end up with the same life we would have anyway. When laid out in these terms, Pascal thinks the choice is obvious: wager for God. You might gain an eternal life and avoid eternal damnation. The worst thing to happen would be nothing changed. So it's a win, no-lose bet from Pascal's perspective. But Pascal's first assessment oversimplifies things. At the very least, believing in God when there is not one would conflict with the truth. Truth is one of the things that Pascal noted that we could lose in this forced wager. Furthermore, for someone who is persuaded to believe in God, he or she might have to change their lifestyle. Maybe they have been indulging in many physical pleasures and so on. So for this person, giving up the pleasures out of respect for religious commitment would involve a tangible loss. Pascal's second analysis acknowledges that wagering on a God when there is not actually a God would involve at least some minimal loss. But Pascal thinks the reasoning still holds. In the table on the right, we see that, as before, wagering on a God when God exists promises an eternal life. Hence, this value is infinite. All of the three other possible outcomes are finite values. What exact value they are does not matter, since they must be qualitatively less than infinity. So even though wagering on God and being wrong would involve the loss of some finite value, the rational choice for Pascal is to aim for the option that gives you both a chance of infinite gain and avoids the risk of infinite misery. At this point, you might be thinking that Pascal's argument is clever, but maybe it's too clever. Clever goes over well when you're in a casino, but this is a different sort of question. You might even be persuaded by Pascal's reasoning, but lacking in belief. Pascal imagines someone describing themselves as having their hands tied. By this he means your head might say to believe in God, but not your heart. After all, forced wagers are not pleasant or spiritually uplifting. To this, Pascal says that you should just pretend. Go to church, perform all the rituals, like taking the holy water and so on. Eventually the faith will come. One way of putting Pascal's advice would be to fake it till you make it. That is, fake it until you actually have faith. In more general terms, Pascal thinks that wagering for God will have some benefits, regardless of whether God exists. You will improve your character and become a good person. You can see Pascal shifting back to speaking as a Christian when he describes gaining goodness as an infinite outcome. In the final sections of our reading, you see Pascal address a handful of possible remaining doubts. Most notable perhaps is the third doubt: I would soon have renounced pleasure had I faith. This relates back to the issue of lacking faith. Pascal flips this doubt on its head, claiming that your faith will come once you change your behavior. Pascal is speaking in part based on personal experience, where he became much more religious in the last decade of his life. There are, however, two major objections that Pascal does not address in his writings. First, his argument can be applied to any theistic account. Pascal himself has in mind Christian theism, but it could be used for most religions, including even polytheistic accounts. The problem is that many of these theistic accounts are not compatible with each other. For instance, believing in a Christian God is not compatible with believing in the gods of ancient Greece or Rome. Thus, it would seem that Pascal's wager leads to contradictory results. The second major objection challenges the very basis of Pascal's argument. The reasoning behind the wager is explicitly self-interested, and for many, this is inherently incompatible with piety. Pascal's argument from this perspective is comparable to treating the divine as the great casino in the sky. But even if you find Pascal's wager morally objectionable, it is at the very least notable for its unusual and carefully thought out approach to the question of whether God exists.